White Lilacs, a novel by Carolyn Meyer. Chapter 2. Freedom. I was afraid Aunt Tilly would tell me I was to stay and serve dinner to the Bell family, but then Cora showed up and I was allowed to leave. When our work was finished, Grandfather and I walked home together. I wasn't too old yet to hold on to his hand. We followed the old trolley tracks east on Oak Street, past the fine houses that were Mr. and Mrs. Bell's neighbors, past the courthouse with the clock that chimed the hour loud enough for us all to hear, and north across Brown Street to Freedom Town. You knew soon as you crossed Brown Street that you were in a different place. Hickory Creek was still swollen from spring rains. The 3 streets that ran north and south and the 3 streets that cut east and west across them were not paved. They were muddy now from where the 2 branches of Hickory Creek crossed over, but later as the summer wore on, my bare feet would be buried in warm dust. Most all the houses were small and plain, without a lick of paint, and set close together. Some might say they looked poor, but each and every one had a little bit of something colorful growing in the front yard. Nothing like Grandfather Jim's, but then that was a special case. You could only have one Garden of Eden. Hand in hand, we walked up Logan Street, on Main Street, with Booker T. Washington Colored School at one end, by Brown Street, and Forgiveness Baptist Church, where my whole family belonged, clear up at the other end by Academy Street. I must have walked up and down that street hundreds of times in my life, maybe thousands, but that day, after I heard that talk at Mrs. Bell's table, I saw it in a way I never did before. I was born in Freedom Town. So was my mother, but all the old people had a story to tell about how they came to be there. Grandmother Lila was a young girl when her family, the Huckabees, moved with a group of other families from near Dallas and helped establish the little settlement in Dillon during Reconstruction, which followed the war between the states. Grandfather Jim had a different story. His papa was a white man who brought his mama, who was once a slave woman, all the way out here from Virginia. He bought her a piece of land right next to his own farm up near Blue Springs. That white man acknowledged Grandfather as his son all along and gave Grandfather's mama money for him and her other children by him. But then he died young, and Grandfather had to move to town to get work to support his mother and sisters. When Grandfather and Grandmother married, they settled in Freedom, and most of their family still lived there. Aunt Tilly was the oldest, and then Uncle Theo, who was married to Aunt Flora, and then Mama. Uncle Walter, the youngest, was married to Aunt Vinnie. My grandfather on Papa's side was part Seminole, but I never knew him. Papa came from East Texas when he was a boy with his father and an uncle and one of Papa's brothers looking for land to farm. Only Papa ended up staying in Freedom, and the others went on west. His mama stayed back in East Texas and got a new husband. We used to hear now and then from Papa's youngest sister, who went to college and was a school teacher in St. Louis. This Aunt Susanna came to visit us once when I was barely 3 years old, but I didn't remember her. We got all kinds in my family, Papa used to say, and I knew that idea tickled him. Sure do, Mama would reply in a way that made me know she didn't entirely approve of families splitting up, some going, some staying. My father owned a barber shop, and my mother took in washing for Mrs. Bell and some other white ladies. Mama wanted me to help out with her laundry business, but I disliked that, preferring to do my helping in Mrs. Bell's garden. She didn't pay me for my work, but grandfather gave me a little something out of his pocket for the time I spent there. Whenever I was not in school, I could be found at Mrs. Bell's with grandfather. Some of the people of Freedom Town worked at the flour mill or the brickyard. Some, like Papa and a dozen others, had their own businesses. Others worked at Dillon Academy for young ladies or a finishing school for white girls with a fine brick building and green lawns just north of Freedom Town. When the wind was right, we could hear the voices in their playing field on the other side of Academy Street, within sight of the Forgiveness Baptist Church. Most of the rest of our people were employed in the homes of rich folks like Mr. and Mrs. Bell on the west side of Dillon, where the houses were very grand and help was needed to clean and cook and serve and take care of the gardens and mind the children. In fact, the rich folks of Dillon could be counted on to give work to most anybody who wanted it. A few, like my brother Henry, refused to work for them no matter what the job. "I won't work for them," Henry said. "People like Mr. Tom Bell think they're at least as good as God Almighty himself." "And you think it's better to work at the brickyard?" my mother argued with him. "It doesn't pay more, and it's such a dirty, dangerous work." "It's better," he insisted. "At least it's man's work." Henry was stubborn. There was no telling him anything, but he was always arguing with Mama and Papa, and they were continually fretting about him and discussing him between themselves. "He doesn't know this place," Mama would mutter to Papa. "He's gonna get into trouble." "He knows his place, he just won't accept it." Henry's not about to accept some white man's idea of what his place is. He said it half proud, half worried. People in Freedom, as a rule, didn't speak out the way my brother Henry did. Henry had been a soldier in the war and got sent to France, and he insisted that things had been different there for the Negroes and would have been more different if the American officers hadn't told the French how to treat colored boys. "I fought for this country," Henry said. "I deserve better." Mama said he hadn't been the same since he came back. He got his hopes up, she explained, and then they were dashed. It was supper time as Grandfather Jim and I walked up Logan Street, and I could smell the cooking. Most of the children had been called inside. Otherwise, it would have been noisy and hectic with dozens of little kids, including my two younger sisters, Laura Lee and Nancy Lee, running around, laughing and playing with all the others. I knew them all. Grandmother Lilla was a midwife who had delivered most of the babies in Freedom Town, sometimes taking care of them when their mamas went back to work. I remembered when I used to be like that, young and carefree, having only to mind my mama and not worry about a thing except when I was going to have a chance to play with my friends. But today I felt about 100 years old ever since I heard those ladies talking at the garden club luncheon about how they were going to make us move away from Freedom Town. If Grandfather's Garden of Eden was my favorite place in Freedom, my next favorite was Grandmother's parlor, where she sat in her big old rocking chair and did her fancy work after whatever baby she was minding had gone to sleep. A second rocking chair was always ready and waiting for a visitor, and I went there whenever I could. That evening, when we entered the house, she was sitting in her chair with a neighbor's colicky baby who she was caring for. It screeched so loud in spite of the rocking I couldn't hear myself think. I decided to go on up Logan Street to my own house. Grandmother called, "Come back tomorrow, Rosalie." Grandfather said he would walk along with me. I wasn't surprised. Our home was stark by comparison. My parents didn't have time or interest in growing anything we couldn't eat, and the yard behind our plain wooden house was strung with clotheslines like the warp of a loom, with only a small garden patch in the corner opposite the privy for a few melons and some okra. Even so, wild hollyhocks stood tall along the veranda, and Grandfather had brought some over petunias to plant by the steps. He couldn't stand to see a yard that wasn't blooming somehow. My father was busy in his barber shop in the front room of our house. He stayed open most evenings right through the supper hour, when his customers had time after their work was done to sit down for a visit, as well as shave and a haircut. When it was warm, as it was that night, the men waited their turn out on the veranda, tipping straight wooden chairs back against the house wall or lounging on the wide steps, carrying on their talk through the open window with whoever was inside. I liked to stay around my father's barber shop, listening to the men talk. I overheard lots of interesting stories there, although my mother didn't approve. Not the proper place for a young lady who might hear bad language and other things that weren't intended for her ears, she claimed. That evening, after the garden club lunch, I stopped in the barber shop before I went on through to tell Mama I was home. A customer was seated in the barber chair, draped with a clean white towel, and another half-dozen men waited their turns. I recognized all of Papa's customers, Mr. Morgan, the undertaker, and said to be the wealthiest man in Freedom. "Why not?" my grandmother said. "Everyone needs him sooner or later." Mr. Lipscomb, who owned a boarding house, Pastor Mobley, a preacher at Forgiveness Baptist Church, Mr. Ross, head janitor at the academy, Mr. Webster, proprietor of the Sun Up Cafe, where the men also gathered to sit and talk, cups of coffee in their hands, while the big, slow fan turned noisily overhead. Most of the important men of Freedom were waiting while my father slipped away at the undertaker's bowed head. Grandfather greeted those on the veranda and followed me inside. "Tell them what you heard, Rosalie." My mouth went dry, with all of them looking at me. My father's scissors hovered in midair. "They want to move us," I said. "The ladies of the Dillon Garden Club were saying at Mrs. Bell's that they want to make us move, all of us move away somewhere so they can turn Freedom into a park." Mr. Webster swore, the kind of language my mother didn't approve of, and I was afraid I would hear at the barber shop. And then he apologized to me and to the preacher. "What have I been telling you?" Mr. Webster went on, looking from one to the next. "Isn't this exactly the rumor we've been hearing and pretending not to hear? And it is not time to believe it now that this children has brought us the word, and to figure out what we're going to do?" The men muttered. I saw heads nodding. "What did you hear them say, Rosalie?" Papa interrupted in his soft, growly voice. "Try to remember everything." Those who were outside crowded into the little shop to listen better. I repeated every detail that came to mind, mentioning this time the lady from up north who spoke in a different way. She was the only one who thought we might not like to be moved, I told them. After they had all asked questions and made me repeat everything I already told them, they began to discuss it among themselves, seeming to forget I was there. That was all right. I preferred to listen anyhow. Papa whisked Mr. Morgan's face and neck with a soft, bristled brush and shook their hairs off the white towel, and Mr. Morgan stepped down of the barber chair, and Pastor Mobley took his place. But the undertaker didn't leave. He settled into the chair the preacher had been waiting in. When a new customer arrived, the men made room for him. More came, but nobody left. When there was no more room inside, they clustered outside the open window. They all wanted to discuss the news I had brought concerning the garden club and its plans to beautify Dillon by getting rid of us. "What are we going to do?" asked one of the men. "We'll make our voices heard," said Papa in his growly voice. "We'll tell them it's our property, legally bought and paid for, papers to prove it." He pulled himself up straight and proud and gripped his scissors like a sword. "We'll tell them we're not leaving. What can they do about it?" One of the men, Mr. Ross, I think it was, chuckled softly. "Do whatever they've a mind to, Charlie, you know that." My brother Henry had come through the heavy green curtain that separated the barber shop from the rest of our house and stood with his arms folded across his chest. He was tall and handsome, with Indian features like Papa's. "We'll fight it, that's what we're going to do," Henry said in a deep voice like Papa's, but younger sounding. "We'll do whatever we have to. They have no right." "Won't do any good to fight it," Mr. Webster said. "You can say all you like, but if they decide to knock down our homes to make their park, then you can bet there'll be a park right where we're standing." The men stayed late, way past the time. Papa generally locked the front door and passed to the other side of the green curtain for the supper Mama had been keeping warm for him. Some agreed with my father. They would fight to save Freedom Town. Others felt it was useless and were mainly concerned about where they would go when they had to leave. Then my mama came to get me, annoyed that I wasn't helping back in the kitchen, starting off with her usual, "Rosalie, how many times do I have to tell you?" "Listen, Mama," I said, made bold by the attention paid me by my father's customers. "This is what I heard," and I repeated the story one more time. I felt proud to be carrying such important news, proud that Papa was going to make our voices heard and Henry was going to fight. And if I knew Grandfather Jim, he wouldn't be sitting quietly while they chased him out of his own Garden of Eden. But Mama didn't look as though she was ready for any fight. My mother burst into tears and cried in front of all those men. That was not the only time she cried in the months that